Hi, Founder fans. Jason here, and today's founder is Benjamin Hawkins, who for a long time, served as Superintendent of Indian Affairs. Now, Benjamin Hawkins was attending Princeton in 1775, like many people we've discussed recently, and when the American Revolutionary War broke out, he left school because, well, there was a war coming to New Jersey. He ended up joining the Continental Army, and he serves actually as an aide-de-camp to George Washington himself. And this is mostly due to the fact that Benjamin Hawkins, at such a young age, had already established himself as a master of several different languages, including Native American languages and French. So when all these generals from France show up to help the Continental Army, well, George Washington can't talk to them. So he has Benjamin Hawkins do the translating for him. And he does this for 2 years, really until the Marquis de Lafayette shows up and kind of edges him out. No fault to Marquis de Lafayette. We all know Lafayette was a very special person, but Hawkins was special himself. He actually resigns from the Continental Army because at just 24 years old, he was elected to the North Carolina General Assembly, his home state. And after a few years there, they send him at just 27 years old to the Continental Congress. He spends about 3 years in the Continental Congress when Congress sends him west. Well, southwest. He's sent down to Georgia to negotiate treaties with the Native American nations. As the Revolutionary War was concluding, peace was being made with Great Britain and Europe, but the Native American nations, they were seen as foreign nations on their own and needed to be negotiated with. And Hawkins went down there and did a very good job. In fact, he ends up becoming very close with the Creek Nation, who was one of the most powerful nations in the area. And I should note, he moves to Georgia where he does establish a plantation, and he would remain there for the majority of the rest of his life. But when the Constitution comes around at the end of the 1780s, well, Benjamin Hawkins is asked to go to the ratification convention and talk about it. Now, Hawkins does go to the convention. I will note, he was in the Continental Congress about the same time Hamilton and Madison were there, and that second class of younger men were the ones who realized some changes had to be made. So when Hawkins goes to the second ratification convention that North Carolina had, he votes in favor of the Constitution. He was always in favor of the Constitution. North Carolina famously doesn't ratify the Constitution in its first attempt, and in fact, doesn't ratify the Constitution until after George Washington is already president. They don't wait as long as Rhode Island does, but they wait a good amount of time. Now, Benjamin Hawkins was kind of a pro-Constitution, but what was then known as anti-administration. He didn't love what Hamilton was doing, what Washington was letting Hamilton do. And this was the prelude to the Democratic Republicans or Jeffersonian Republicans that would come around later. So he was kind of a middleman. He did like the Constitution, which a lot of North Carolina didn't, but he also didn't love the power that was being used, which most North Carolinians agree with. And this is the reason that he was selected as an inaugural senator to the United States Senate representing North Carolina. Again, he shows up pretty late to the game because North Carolina waited a while, but Hawkins is there for a few years, and then he leaves that office because he is appointed by George Washington as General Superintendent for Indian Affairs. And in this position, he was responsible really for all correspondence with Native Americans, but his focus was all the Native American nations from Ohio south. Basically taking up the job he had already had under the Continental Congress, but this time under the United States Constitution. And he would remain there for really the rest of his life. About 20 years he would hold this office under several presidential administrations. Despite several attempts to resign, he was the man for the job. He ends up signing a bunch of really important treaties. As I said, the Creek Nation in particular he got along with. They end up convincing him to marry a woman of their nation, therefore bringing him in under the umbrella of Creek. However, he keeps peace for a long time until eventually Benjamin Hawkins was one of many people at the time that thought the best thing for the Native Americans was to have them assimilate into white colonial or American culture. That way they could become part of the culture and there wouldn't be any tension left. This is obviously still something that could be hotly debated today as to what the best way to help people might be in this particular situation. The Creek had just lost a war, and Hawkins, they earned his trust because he was sympathetic to them, and he wanted to help them the best way he could determine how. Now, we might disagree with how he determined what should happen, but he did convince many of the elders in the Creek Nation to start practicing more traditionally European ways of life. That being said, by 1810, you have a bunch of the younger generations, and are the kids always a little bit rebellious? Some of the younger Creek are more apt to practice their traditional heritage, their old belief systems, and they start doing so. Now, this actually causes a divide within the Creek Nation itself, and what erupts is called the Creek War. And the Creek War was essentially a civil war between the Creek peoples. Benjamin Hawkins is there the whole time trying to end it, trying to bring the Creek back together, make everything honky-dory all over again. Unfortunately, this is going on just as the War of 1812 is going on. And Andrew Jackson comes along because he is, well, fighting for the Americans, really against the British, but out in the West. He would later go to New Orleans famously, but there was always issues with certain Native American tribes, I shouldn't say with them, between them and these settlers going out west in Tennessee and Kentucky and what was then Georgia, we now know as Mississippi, Alabama. There was always tensions there, and Andrew Jackson went to stop the Creek War because he needed to go war with Great Britain. And he does stop the Creek War, and he essentially suppresses both sides. Now, Hawkins did raise an outfit of Creek to fight in the war who were sympathetic to the Americans. However, Andrew Jackson comes through and basically puts a stop to all of it. Unfortunately, Benjamin Hawkins was not able to get there for the treaty that Andrew Jackson puts through. And unfortunately, it is not very friendly to the Creeks in general. Now, Andrew Jackson, of course, later would 20 years later be president of the United States and send these same Creek people on the Trail of Tears. And the Creek War is kind of the beginning of that tension, specifically between the Creek and Andrew Jackson. As for Hawkins, I can only assume he was heartbroken to see his decades worth of work building relationships with the Creek Nation absolutely destroyed. And then he would sadly pass away from old age just a few years later. So that's the story of Benjamin Hawkins, a really fascinating character in the southwestern United States during the American founding. It ends on kind of a down note, but for the most part, Hawkins did a really fantastic job trying to build bridges between peoples who really had so much difference between each other. Again, we might disagree with how he went about it and how he thought the best way to proceed might be, but he was doing it with the best of intentions, doing his best to unite the Creek people with the people of the young United States. So that's an overview of the life of Benjamin Hawkins, a really fascinating and super underappreciated American founder, as with most people who fought out west and participated out west during the American founding. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, hit like, and if you're new here, hit subscribe. I put up videos about the American Revolution and its founders 7 days a week.